policy, so-called wet foot, dry foot? What do you do if folks start arriving in the United States?
Well, Brian, first of all, I guess the only thing I would suggest is I don't think that Fidel is going to meet his maker. I think he's going to go the other place. Second, I would suggest to you the policy of the United States should be aggressively to overthrow the regime and to do everything we can to support those Cubans who want freedom. You know, Obama is very infatuated with an Arab Spring. He doesn't seem to be able to look 90 miles south of the United States to have a Cuban Spring. So I would try to put in place a very aggressive policy of reaching out to every single Cuban who would like to be free, helping network them together, reaching out to the younger generation inside the dictatorship and indicating they don't have a future as a dictatorship because a Gingrich presidency will not tolerate 4 more years of this dictatorship.
Overt and covert? Are you talking about engaging the U.S. military?
No, I'm talking about using every asset available in the United States, including appropriate covert operations, to maximize the distance. What Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, and Margaret Thatcher did to the Soviet Empire. Bring together every asset we have to minimize the survival of the dictatorship and to maximize the chance for freedom in Cuba.
Congressman?
I have a little bit of work to do yet on him on foreign policy. No. I would do pretty much the opposite. I don't like the isolationism of not talking to people. I was drafted in 1962 at the height of the Cold War when the missiles were in Cuba. And the Cold War is over. And I think we propped up Castro for 40-some years because we put on these sanctions, and this only used us as the scapegoat. He could always say, anything wrong, it's the United States' fault. But I think it's time to quit this isolation business of not talking to people. We talked to the Soviets, we talked to the Chinese, and we opened up trade, and we're not killing each other now. We fought with the Vietnamese for a long time. We finally gave up, started talking to them. Now we trade with them. I don't know why the Cuban people should be so intimidated. Brett, I don't know where you get this assumption that all of a sudden all the Cubans are coming here. I would have thought they were going to celebrate and they're going to have a lot more freedom if we would only open up our doors and say, we want to talk to you and trade with you and come visit. Sometimes they can't even send packages down there. I think we're living in the dark ages when we can't even talk to the Cuban people. I think it's not 1962 anymore, and we don't have to use force and intimidation and overthrow in governments. I just don't think that's going to work.
Senator Santorum, an admittedly cynical question. If there was a strong lobby of Chinese dissidents living in a state as politically important as Florida, do you think we'd have a trade policy with China that looks more like the trade policy with Cuba?
Not if they were not 90 miles off our shore. This is an important doctrine of the United States to make sure that our hemisphere and those who are close to us are folks that we can and should deal with. And right now we have and have had for 50 years a dictatorship in Cuba. We've had sanctions on them. They should continue. They should continue until the Castros are dead, and then we should make it very clear that if you want mountains of aid, if you want normal relationships, if you want to improve your economy, if you want to have the opportunity for freedom, that the United States stands ready now to embrace you now that you've gotten rid of these tyrants who have controlled you for these 50-plus years. That's why the sanctions have to stay in place, because we need to have a very solid offer to come forward and help the Cuban people. And you're right, Ron, it's not 1962. They're now, with the Cubans and the Venezuelans, the Nicaraguans, there is a growing network of folks now working with the jihadists, the Iranians, who are very, very excited about the opportunity to having platforms 90 miles off our coast, just like the Soviets were. Very anxious to have platforms 90 miles off our coast, or in Venezuela, or in Nicaragua, and other places that could come across the southern border. This is a serious threat. It's a threat that I've been talking about for about 6 or 7 years, and it's one that's not going to go away until we confront the threat and hopefully are able to convince the Cuban people that, through what Newt and others have suggested, to change their government at the appropriate time.
Governor Romney, last night, the Abe Lincoln U.S. aircraft carrier and a couple other attendant U.S. Navy vessels passed through the Strait of Hormuz into the Persian Gulf. If Iran was able to carry out that threat to shut down the strait, would you consider that an act of war? What would you do about it as president?
Of course it's an act of war. It is appropriate and essential for our military, for our Navy to maintain open seas. We have control of the commons, of space, air, and the seas. Our Navy has the capacity to do that, or did in the past. Under this president and under prior presidents, we keep on shrinking our Navy. Our Navy is now smaller than any time since 1917. And the president is building roughly 9 ships a year. We had to raise that to 15 ships a year, not because we want to go to war with anyone, but because we don't want anyone to take the hazard of going against us. We want them to see that we're so strong they couldn't possibly defeat us. So we ought to have an aircraft carrier in the Gulf, an aircraft carrier, and of course the task force with it in the Mediterranean. We want to show Iran any action of that nature will be considered an act of war, an act of terror, and America is going to keep those sea lanes open.
So, Speaker Gingrich, if you accept that bedrock definition that it is an act of war, how do you gauge the appetite on the part of the American people after the better part of a decade of warfare, fighting dual wars overseas, for something like that?
The American people have no interest in going to war anywhere. We had no interest in going to war with the Japanese when they bombed Pearl Harbor. We had no interest in going to Afghanistan when jihadists destroyed the World Trade Center. The fact is, we've historically been a country that would like peace, we'd like stability, but we also have a historic commitment to freedom of the sea. And I would say that the most dangerous possible thing, which, by the way, Barack Obama just did, the Iranians are practicing closing the Straits of Hormuz, actively taunting us, so he cancels a military exercise with the Israelis so as not to be provocative. Now, dictatorships respond to strength. They don't respond to weakness. And I think there's a very grave danger that the Iranians think that, in fact, this president is so weak, they could close the Straits of Hormuz and not suffer substantial consequences.
Governor Romney, how do you end a war in Afghanistan without talking to the Taliban?
By beating them, by standing behind our troops and making sure that we have transitioned to the Afghan military, a capacity for them to be successful in holding off the Taliban. Our mission there is to be able to turn Afghanistan and its sovereignty over to a military of Afghan descent, Afghan people that can defend their sovereignty. And that is something which we can accomplish in the next couple of years. This president, however, has made it very difficult for our troops to be able to be successful in that mission by, number one, announcing a withdrawal date for our troops, number two, drawing down our surge troops faster than the time the commanders on the ground felt was necessary. You don't draw them down during the middle of the fighting season. And finally, by not overseeing elections in Afghanistan to assure that the selection of their president was seen by the people as being legitimate. And he has failed in executing a policy in Afghanistan that would optimize our prospects of success.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask, any appetite on this stage to negotiate with the Taliban? Congressman?
No, and I wanted to get involved in the discussion.
No, go ahead.
Because the question was, would you go to war? And Mitt said he would go to war. But you have to think about the preliminary act that might cause them to want to close the Straits of Hormuz, and that's a blockade. We're blockading them. Can you imagine what we would do if somebody blockaded the Gulf of Mexico? That would be an act of war. So the act of war has already been committed, and this is a retaliation. But besides, there's no interest whatsoever for Iran to close the Straits of Hormuz. I mean, they need it as much as we do. I mean, so you have to put that in a perspective. But this whole idea that we have to go to war because we've already committed an act by blockading the country, and I don't see. And I think Newt is right. I think he's wrong about World War II. I think the people were ready because we did it properly and we declared it and we won it quickly. But no, the people are not ready. We don't have any money. We have too many wars. The people want to come home, and they certainly don't want a hot war in Iran right now. And I think that would be the most foolish thing in the world to do right now is take on Iran.
Right now, for us, another break. I'll welcome two colleagues out here to the stage when we continue from Tampa right after this.